We're going to have a chat about some of the things that we need to do as consumers, as metals producers, as designers, as materials users, in order to enable our sustainable future. So, but before we get into it, I'm going to ask my panel to introduce themselves. I'm so privileged and so excited to have this group of experts. So without further ado, Katherine, please tell us all about you.
Hello, can you hear me? Privilege is a nice word, thank you. So I'm Katherine Adams. I'm Technical Director at the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. So I've been there about 5 years. I also work for myself. I have a company called Reusefully as well. So I guess for the last 20 years I've really been involved in the whole area of construction and demolition waste, resource efficiency across all different materials. Now all called circular economy. A lot of my time was spent at BRE actually, building research establishment, so very much came from sort of a research evidence-based background, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do and our projects and some of the questions, answers even.
That's great, thank you, Katherine. Nick, tell us about you.
Hi, good afternoon everybody. My name's Nick Silk. I've been in the steel and metals industry for about 30 years, forging, rolling, and steel industry in general more recently. I'm currently Business Development Manager at Tata Steel for sustainability, and I'm very interested in decarbonisation and circularity.
Thanks, Nick. Last but certainly not least, Richard.
Least in years. So I've been in the steel industry about 10 years. And I worked through I was in R&D for Tata Steel in Teesside, hence the accent, for a few years until that was sort of closed and we turned that into what's now MPI. But for the last 4 years I've been working for Cameron and Dave Worsley down in Swansea on the Sustain project. So the Sustain project is effectively the UK's major decarbonisation programme for the UK steel industry. We have Tata, British Steel, Forge Masters, Liberty Steel as part of the programme, together with Warwick, Swansea and Sheffield universities. And we have a programme of projects where we are looking to decarbonise steel in different ways, looking at, say, a blast furnace, how we can reuse the gases, how we can make the blast furnace process more efficient, through the arc furnace, reuse of materials, scrap, materials passports. It's effectively anything that would decarbonise steel we're starting projects on, and we also have outreach to other universities for other ideas as well to bring in to help the steel industry move into this new generation of decarbonised steelmaking.
It's great, thank you to my panel. So we've got a great blend of skills and knowledge on the panel, so please tax them with your questions a bit later. But I'm going to start off by posing maybe a controversial question given the environment we're in, but we all know that metals production, whether it's steel, aluminium, copper, whatever, is bad for the environment, right? We're all emitting CO2, so why don't we just stop making metals and carry on reusing what we've got? Why do we need to keep making metals? Nick, maybe you'd like to start us off with that one.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think the point has been made today in other sessions, but there's just not enough scrap available globally for everything to be made from used steel, should we say. So around 40% of global demand could be met from scrap. So on a global perspective, it really isn't practical to meet steel demand from just scrap alone. We obviously need to decarbonise, but we also need to decarbonise the manufacturing process for new steel, not just for recycling old steel, which is essentially a relatively low carbon process already. I think the other thing we can say is that metals have a brilliant reuse. They're readily recyclable. We can do better in the way we recycle metals, and we'll perhaps talk about that in a minute. But certainly I think we can make better use of the resource that we do have as a second life steel already.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think you make that point about demand and have we already got enough on the planet, and maybe not. I mean, Katherine, what's your view from the building sector? Can we get by by just making what we've already got on the planet? Why do we need to make more metal?
I'd love to say yes, but I don't think I can, unfortunately. Obviously, we just continue to build more and more. There is a push to demolish less and refurbish our buildings, which could affect some amount of, of the steel availability and the steel that we need. I'm very much more on the reuse agenda rather than recycling, but the proportion that's actually reused at the moment is such tiny amount, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. So that there's so much work to do in terms of just the longevity of the steel and making sure that it does have a second life. But also, reused steel isn't always the right solution either in terms of the properties and the weight of it. But no, there's a continuing demand. But I think we can be a lot more cleverer in some of the products that we use, how we use them, and how we design in terms of light weighting, some of the beams and the sections and that, and much more work could be done there, which would reduce some of the demand. Sorry, steel manufacturers.
Oh no, that's perfect, thank you. And Rich, I mean, obviously you see the industry from a different perspective, from a research perspective. I mean, what do you think? Why do we need to bother making more metal? Surely we've made enough.
I think as technology sort of develops, we get better. It's a point there, Katherine made. As technology develops, we get better and more efficient at using the material. So we need new material to develop that to make it better. And I think we'll always have that, or we'll have that for a very long time into the future. Also, things break, things corrode. We haven't perfected the materials yet, so they'll last forever. Stainless steel producers will say just use stainless steel, but there's issues with that as well. But I think we've definitely got to have material coming through, and then also we've got that lag between the use and it's then say scrappage to be reprocessed, say through the arc furnace process in a green way. I think we probably don't have enough. We probably have enough steel, but we probably don't have technology right at the right level where that steel could be used indefinitely.
Okay.
And there's a cultural thing as well, isn't there? I mean, everybody wants to have something that's the latest edition and a new version of.
Okay, so I mean, maybe staying with you then, Richard. I mean, so if we've established that we need to make more metal, and you've all given great answers to that question. So, as metal producers, metal manufacturers, what do we need to do in the industry then to have a more sustainable industry, more sustainable products?
It depends. I mean, you could take this two ways. So one of the things that we've been looking at in Sustain is that we go down this route of adding alloys to steels to make them last longer, to give them better properties, but that makes them more difficult to recycle. So you could take the tack of going back to more of a basic route, maybe look at more coatings, and then having steels that you can more readily recycle. Or do you go down the route of you perfect that steel or material that's going to last forever, which is probably not feasible, but big it lasts for a long time. I think there are two options there, and I'm not sure which one's the correct one. If we do go down, if we have sufficient energy, then there's no problem with actually just recycling the steel by melting it down and reusing it. In which case, if that's the way forward, then we go down the reducing the amount of alloys we put in. We make the scrap recycling process more efficient. But we're really struggling with energy at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Nick, what's your view? I mean, you work for Tata Steel. We're a metal producer. What do people like Tata Steel and other colleagues in the industry need to do to make our products more sustainable?
Well, first I'll make the point that I think our products are very sustainable if you look at recycling statistics. So if you look at sort of end-of-life recycling of steel, it's about 90%, and pre-consumer scrap about 100%. So there's that part of the circularity loop is a given, the end of life. But I think Katherine made a really good point earlier about this sort of circularity hierarchy, and we really need to focus much more on reuse and repurposing and longevity, as Richard made the point. So in other words, we could easily put coatings on automobiles to make them last 20 to 30 years instead of 10 to 15 years. That technology is easily there if we wanted to make vehicles last longer and service them, etc. So we could make products last longer. We can certainly make things reusable. We already offer modular buildings. We have our seismic project, the BRE that Katherine mentioned. You know, that was assembled in 3 days and is a completely reusable building that we can reconfigure, different shape of room layout, everything, and just rebuild and repurpose. Ideal for schools, classrooms, things like that. It's currently set up as a classroom, but we could make it into a small hospital or whatever else. So I think that's an important thing. And I think then that if we look at the sort of, if you like, the last resort is the recycling of the steel. So yes, we absolutely need a solution for end-of-life steel making, but really what can we do at the hierarchy before it comes to that, because that's the last resort.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And you're right. I mean, we always jump to recycling, but actually that's the last thing we want to do in this circular journey that we're on. Katherine, what about you as a user of steel? You know, what do you want to see materials producers doing to become more sustainable?
I've got a long list. I won't go for it. We'll be here all day. Just ask everyone. Look up. Everyone, look up and see all that steel above you. You know, there's a whole load there. There's gantries, there's trusses, there's piping, ducting, all sorts. I go into buildings, try and quantify all this, and then I try and advise the clients to say, well, you know, can we reuse any of this? Really, really, really hard for that to happen. A lot of the time, there's just no information on any of these systems, you know, so we don't have any of the manufacturer's information. We don't know how old they are. We don't know, you know, what they're made of, where they've come from, so the provenance isn't there. So having much more sort of information that's available with that product cuts me out, which I'm happy to do. So to enable those products to be reused and have the certainty, you know, and assurance of those products, and if they need to be recertified, be warranted. And then also just, you know, I talk to quite a lot of manufacturers, and I'm like, you know, products are coming out of building, you know, they're only 10, 20 years old, some of these buildings that are getting knocked down or refurbished. And I'm not saying Tata Steel here, but they, you know, you say, can you take back your product and reuse it and resell it? It doesn't happen, you know, and it's crazy really, you know, that to them, there's probably is, you know, you need to get the business model right, but there's probably is a cost saving because they've already got the raw materials. You just need to work out the processes for being able to sort of re-warranty it. And there are a few examples of that, but nowhere near enough. So that's more on the sort of existing product side. And then I guess on the new products, again, lots and lots of information, but I think in construction as well, you know, we have to work, we've been saying this for like 20 years, but we have to work in a very collaborative manner across the supply chain. So that, you know, that's the fabricators working with the designers, being much more efficient in, you know, I was talking to one fabricator the other day actually, and they'd, you know, just by having the drawings early and being able to put them into their own model, I think they'd saved about 75% of the steel just for like much better utilisation factors. So yeah, very much a joined up approach, and manufacturers very much need to be part of that.
Great answer, and segues beautifully into my next question, almost planned, which is about, you know, that design of products, that design of buildings, automotive, whatever it is that's using these metals. What do we need to do differently, Katherine? I'll start with you. What do we need to do differently in how we design those products so that they're more sustainable and easier to put into this circular economy that we all wish for?
I think it's starting to happen slowly, and there are a few drivers, especially in London now. So there's planning requirements to have circular economy statements and whole life carbon assessments where they do require you to look at end of life scenarios and design for disassembly and deconstruction. But to me, it's very much designing with future use in mind and looking at where that steel is, where it's used, how it's connected to other materials as well. Especially, you know, I think we're going to see more hybrid solutions of steel and timber construction, but the interconnections between those two is really, really important, both in terms of buildability, but then disassembly, end of life as well. So all those sort of connections and interfaces I think are really, really important. And then just having a real better understanding of how hard you can make that steel work in that building or infrastructure project.
Yeah, I guess, like you say, it's about really understanding what's going to happen to that material after its first use and what can we do in the second. Nick, you've spent a lot of time working with the automotive companies. What from an automotive point of view, or indeed a steel point of view, what could we do differently about how we design cars or other products that are steel intensive to help with the circular economy?
Well, I think lightweighting has been a strong driver for years because of tailpipe emissions. So we're using less steel than we were to make bigger vehicles, heavier vehicles than we were. I think it was mentioned in an earlier session actually, that the size of vehicles is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's almost laughable when we want to reduce consumption. And so everybody wanting the latest SUV is not exactly helping us use less materials and being less shall we say, protective about our personal requirement for things. In terms of automotive, I think that there's a massive focus on circularity now within the automotive sector. They'd like to see, I think they want to see a better provenance for the end of life of their vehicles in particular. So they'd like to see that the scrap is used to its best possible potential in second life. So when a car is shredded, that is not necessarily the best use of that steel at end of life, especially if it's mixed in with copper and aluminium. The aluminium would be better off nicely separated, going back to its circular supply chain. Copper, we really don't want copper in steel, and the copper industry really don't want steel in copper. If we can separate the two, both can have lovely circular pathways. So as we go to electric vehicles, it's going to be much more important to have really powerful separation and segregation techniques to really make sure that all those material flows are as circular as possible and their scrap types are preserved to their highest potential.
Yeah, so such a great point. We'll congratulate ourselves because we've got 50 miles per gallon on our new SUV, whereas we'd have stayed with our small car, we'd have had 60, 70, 80 miles per gallon. So yeah, as consumers, there's definitely more work to do. Richard from R&D, and I know there's a lot of work going on in this space about how we design products to allow them to be more recyclable, but give us your point of view. What do we need to do around the product design point of view?
I'd like to maybe take it a slightly different direction, because I think it's going to be more about the ownership side, because I think when you've got, whether it's construction, whether it's autos, wherever, if somebody needs to own that material, because you're always going to have that problem of what's this, what's that, where does this go? The downcycling of the scrap when it's recycled. If the and we were talking about this earlier on, because nobody really wants to have a situation where they don't own the car, don't own the washing machine, But this whole idea of steel as a service is coming in now. So maybe the steel company or the automotive company or the construction company actually owns the building, and then they will then know everything in there. They'll have that ownership and they'll have to do that. Then that makes a much simpler problem, and it also feeds back. I'm not going to make a comment on how they should design it, but I think that would make an organic feedback into how they design it, because they're going to then simplify to make it more recyclable because it's in their interests. And I think that's part of the problem, that it's not in anybody's interests to actually to specify these things and take ownership of them. And I think having that, and things like material passports and things we were discussing earlier as well, having that in there where we can actually trace where the steel's come from, even down to how much carbon's been emitted to manufacture it, to make the decision of, what can we recycle, what should we reuse, what should we, fix, and sort of put back into the market again. I think that all comes down to that ownership, which at the moment ends up being millions, if not billions, of consumers. If you've got, smaller points of ownership that then have control over these things, I think that's going to have a much bigger impact on the recycling process.
That's a great angle, Rich, and I think, again, our consumer behaviour probably has something to say. So I've got several more questions for the panel, but I'd like to open it up to the audience. So does anybody have a question for our illustrious panel? You've heard some of their points of view. Alex is at the back there. What do you want? Ask away.
Thanks, Alex Small from Tata Steel. Obviously hearing your views on, in particular, getting the material back. What role do you think digital tools and the flow of data, product data, is going to play? And do you think that the construction, automotive, and steel sector are making the right moves, moving in the right direction to enable some of this?
Do you want to start us off with that one, Katherine?
It's definitely getting better. Talking to there's really good sort of 3D model information around now on buildings. That's quite commonplace now. Going into sort of all the built BIM models and such like. There could be more done probably at the product level in terms of traceability and tracking, and we've got a project looking at that at ASBP called eTracks, trying to understand how that could happen. It's not easy. You think something should be so easy, but when you dwell into it, it's not, unfortunately, because this steel can last for a long time. So having an appropriate sort of tag that lasts as long as the steel can be questionable, and steel can get chopped up and all this sort of thing as well. But it is getting better, and I think the future is very much sort of that whole digital twin, material passports, etc., etc. But you also need to know that information exists, and with buildings, their ownership can change so many times, and I do see that as an issue, and just in that continuity of keeping that information alive. And even just the technology, microfiche, we're looking at microfishes in terms of drawings. We may have to go back to some of that if all our technology changes.
Well, that's a great point, isn't it? It'd be no good us having lots of data today which isn't readable in 25 years' time. That's going to be a real challenge. Nick, what's your view on data? How important is the data, and how we present our data going to be for this circular economy?
I think it's really powerful. I think obviously construction is almost leading the way in that respect, and certainly the reuse and the provenance of steel is going to be a key factor in its reuse. So being able to really track and trace is very important. I would say that that's not quite so strong in other sectors, particularly, but it's that power of being able to, another option, and you alluded to it, I think really, is this leasing of steel. And if we're going to have a leasing model, which is very practical for steel, in a building, the steel producer gets it back at end of life, can check that it's still fit for purpose, and can reissue it for new buildings with a new certification. That sort of track and trace is absolutely vital. But just to build on a point Katherine made, imagine you buy a tube and you're going to use it in construction, and you cut it into 36 pieces and they're all then welded together and fabricated. Keeping that traceability and tracking, you can see the complexity. So there's plenty of practical solutions to overcome, but it's really powerful if we can do it.
Thanks, Nick. And I guess, one area that always baffles me, and maybe Richard, you've got some insight on this, is how do we all develop the same data system? So it's no good Tata having one way of doing it and another steel producer having another way of doing it. In the work that you're involved in with the sort of all of the steel producers, how is that conversation being had?
An analogy would be something that's similar that's happening in the plants as well, because we've got a lot of legacy technology, and it's all down to making sure that let's say Steve Thornton's Googleization project and ontologies and stuff like that. So I think you might have lots of different systems, but we need to have some form of translational ability between them, which is where your AI and various other things come in. But I think, to sort of answer the question, I think digital is going to have a massive effect, because we need to have huge databases, open databases that can be read and translated between different software packages, let's say, so we have access to what is out there. What is, we don't know how long the steel is going to last. We can make estimates. We would know when steel is coming close to being at the end of its lifetime, or if a building's going to be brought down, or cars are going to be brought in before their respective lifetimes sort of being hit, and when it's being hit. And of course there's sort of variability between all of that. And I think, yet again, statistical models a bit of AI, and I also think as well it's going to be a bit of a hybrid overall between basic recycling and reuse. And I know I hit on that thing of not owning anything, you know, steel as a service. I don't think that fits well with everyone, but it will with some people. It might change through time. And I think there's also that social aspect again that we've got to keep. We can't be draconian and say this is the way things are going to be. I think there's got to be that soft, you know, transition, or maybe a hybrid for forever that sort of keeps things going. So I don't know, but I think digital's going to have a massive effect. We do need to have something that's translational between the different applications, the different databases, and all of that's a lot easier now with the high computational power we have, and maybe using a bit of AI to help with the ontologies.
Yeah, go on, please.
I think as well, it's just having, you know, I work with Tata Steel a bit on the whole kit of parts approach and the whole standardisation, and that is making sure that, you know, certain steel elements are all designed pretty much in the same way, so they are interchangeable between, you know, different manufacturers. And so within that, there's that whole sort of, you know, database of knowing that, a whole load of database of standardised connections and that sort of thing, which should be too hard to do, but we still don't really have that in my knowledge anyway. So, you know, I think that's an important thing to pick up on.
That's great. And it's this balance, isn't it, between standardisation but also having some competition, and it's a difficult balance. And I love the thought of having an open databases, open platforms, which comes back to your point about collaboration in the industry. How do we work together in this space for the good of the supply chain? So interesting times. Great question, Alex. Thank you so much. Anybody else have any questions for our panel?
Hi there, Phil Chaplin, also from Tata Steel. For there to be sustainable metals, there have to be sustainable business models, and that makes me think of value, and that in turn makes me think of the consumer. What's the role of the consumer, and dare I say, make it even more difficult, society, in the goal of sustainable metal?
Question. So we're all consumers as well as metals experts in the room. So what do we have to do differently? Let's start with Nick.
All right, I'll tell you a small anecdote. I still drive a 10-year-old, 11-year-old diesel car. That sounds dreadful. It's not an EV. But from a life cycle perspective, is that the best thing for the planet? That I'm keeping this thing on the road for as long as possible. Yeah, maybe it's time to change. But but on the other hand, seriously, there's a lot of embodied carbon in a vehicle, and an EV's probably got an even higher carbon footprint, to put it bluntly. So keeping this on the road isn't such a bad thing to be doing until it's an appropriate time to say goodbye. But we do all have to change our habits, don't we, as consumers? We have to want less things and perhaps be more willing to have services. I'm quite a fan of public transport. I use it whenever I can. So the car doesn't actually get out that much, but when it does, no. So I do think that it's making different choices about what we buy in life, whether we really need things or whether we can hire them, rent them, and use less just consumption.
Thanks, Nick. Katherine, what's your thoughts? What do we need to do differently as consumers, maybe users of buildings? What's your view?
I agree with Nick. I've also got I think it's a 12-year-old car, but it's a petrol car, so I'm slightly one-up possibly. Anyway, that's another discussion. But yeah, we all just have too much stuff, really. That's the same for all. You know, steel's not the culprit there, or metals. It's the same for all materials. We all have too much stuff. There is a bit of a move within the circular economy. It's very slow though, in terms of, you know, places having lending libraries and tool libraries and stuff like that. So, you know, I look at my shed, I've got tools in that which come out like once or twice a year. It's much better if you can share that sort of thing. From a building point of view, it's quite difficult in the construction industry. It is quite a conservative beast. don't like risk. You know, there are models where there is sort of leasing of products, but they're really, you know, not very apparent, and they're very much for the, you know, sort of shorter-lived products almost. I think what could be done much more, and probably what isn't looked at all very much, is the whole sort of building utilisation, and also sort of the sharing of spaces as well. So a lot of our buildings are just underutilised. Can we not be a bit better with the space that we already have instead of building new the whole time? And then also in terms of the sharing of space, so have space which is, you know, co-functional really, an office during the daytime, a nightclub or pub at night. Maybe that's not a good example, but you know, but you know what I mean. And I think we'd be trying to think. I think we should be trying to think in terms of a bit more, you know, wider systems thinking when it comes to our sort of design of our space and the buildings that we live in.
Yeah, I think and you make a really great point. I mean, I quite like the idea, and obviously it turns into a nightclub, but that's a whole different debate. But yeah, I mean, so much of our stuff is lying around but not being used. Our buildings are empty for most of the time. You know, we really could think about how to use this stuff better. Rich, what do you think about this? What do we as consumers need to do differently?
Well, I think obviously we've got to consider, you know, the carbon burden. We've also got to consider that we can't do anything without money and without, you know, things being economically viable as well. Ultimately, I think there'll be, as I mentioned earlier, I think there'll be some sort of a hybrid system, but also to fit into this yet again. I mean, it's got me thinking that conversation we had about sort of culture and society, because there's human nature. It's human nature to own things and to have things, and I think, you know, maybe we have gone too far, but I think if you took all of that away and you effectively had everything, you didn't own anything, and you just, I think that might psychologically be bad for human beings. And I think ultimately we're going to have this balance between the financial, the carbon, you know, burden, and also what's good for our mental health as well. You know, and I don't think that gets brought up enough, but it'd be just a sadder world if we all ended up depressed and because we own nothing, as it was if we destroyed the earth with you know, carbon dioxide and climate change. So I think we've got to get the balance right.
A great comment to start to wrap up on. So I think we've probably got time for one more question, if there is anything. No? Okay. So, I mean, I've got one killer question left for the panel, which I know they're really looking forward to. But before we get to that, I mean, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground in this conversation. I hope you agree. You know, all from, you know, do we need metals to how can we produce them more sustainably? How can we design products more sustainably? And then, latterly, the kind of psychology of being a consumer and the psychology of stuff, which is I would really like to carry on talking about, but I better not. So, it's been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. But I have one more question for you. So, you know, you are in the position for 2 minutes of being master of the universe. So what, if you had your magic wand and you were master of the universe, what's the one thing you would do to enable a sustainable future? Katherine? Go on.
I didn't want to go first, actually. I was going to listen to what these two said.
Oh, Richard's going to be a gentleman. Go on then, Richard. Go on.
Basically, if we could solve the energy crisis, the energy problem, because if we had, you know, unlimited energy without, you know, a carbon burden on it, then that would solve a lot of problems. Because we could have everything we wanted, you know, we could process steel with electricity without causing, you know, the issues of emitting carbon dioxide. We could have unlimited hydrogen. You know, I guess everyone knows you produce hydrogen, the efficiency is sort of, you know, 60%. Then you have to compress it and transport it. Goes down to about 25% efficient. So you need 4 times the power plants you would normally need to produce electricity, produce hydrogen. If we had unlimited energy, I think it would solve all of the problems, and we could all have we could have as many things as we wanted and have decadent lifestyles.
Brilliant, thank you. Nick? Go on, what would you use your magic wand for?
Well, I was also going to go down the energy front. I mean, if you think about metals generally, it takes about 20 to 25 gigajoules per tonne to make steel using coal at the moment. If we transition to making hydrogen-based steel, it's going to be about 14 gigajoules per tonne, so it'll be a decarbonised energy, but it won't be any less energy intensive. And it'll be, about 3 to 4 gigajoules per tonne for melting scrap to make new steel. It's not just steel, it's about aluminium, it's hugely energy intensive. So metals generally, we have the technology to recycle them, purify them, remake them into useful things. And we can develop the technologies for better sorting and better reuse. So I would say again that ultimately plentiful, cheap, green energy is a really massive factor in the future of the metals industry for the world, but the UK as well.
And yeah, energy's been a subject of conversation in a number of sessions today, haven't it? So it's a common theme that's coming through. Katherine?
Yeah, yeah. I think we need to get anywhere near net zero. Much more reuse, better circular economy. You're really looking at system levels change. That's a big ask, because it requires us all to work together. It requires us to have that enabling environment. It requires government to provide that enabling environment. I don't like GDP. If you look at the whole economics and there's the whole donut economics where we should be looking at ourselves much more in terms of valuing our environment, our well-being, and that. So I'm not sure I could ramble on about this for ages. And then within all that is people and all the vested interests which occur in all industries and all construction's the same as well. So I'm not really sure I've got a magic wand. I'm just sort of moaning on a bit, but yeah, I think it would be really to sort of really look at that and put people and the systems at the heart of what we do. We're really good. Manufacturers are great at coming up with technical solutions. I don't think that's really where the problems lie so much. It's providing that enabling environment to let them do that.
Great. Yeah, you're right. And it's we are all people. We all live on a planet. We're part of the problem as well as part of the solution. So a great way to end. Thank you all for listening. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've enjoyed the insights as much as I have. And please join me in thanking our panel today, Katherine, Nick and Richard.